Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. We'll start with the housekeeping stuff. As mentioned, tonight's only going to be one blot. Tomorrow morning at 7:10, we'll learn Mem Hey Amud Aleph, which is effectively a full blot on its own. On Shabbos, we'll learn whatever's left over on Mem Hey, Amud Beis, and Mem Vav, and then we'll be all caught up. And the Shabbos shiur is earlier than usual. Normally it would have been around 7, but now it's going to be 5:45 because there's a shiur by, what's his first name? Something Shlomo?
Was it translated or is he speaking English?
Yeah.
He speaks English?
No.
Oh, right. Naftali Weinberg, maybe? Something like that. Either way, let's get started. We are still going to be speaking more about Avadim, another technical Gemara that we need to get through. And the Gemara starts on the top of Mem Dalet Amud Aleph on the second line. Tanu Rabbanan, there's a Tosefta here in this Masechta. If somebody collects their chov by taking your eved, shalakhu sikrikon, or if your eved was taken by sikrikon, which is effectively a mafia type of thing. Ayin in the Rishonim on this word. It's a very unique word. Rashi says 12 lines down. Rashi says B'shashe Yisrael muvkarin lehariga, at a time when the Jewish people were killed at will. Ve'amar le'oved kochavim sa karka zu. It's either you or your karka. So it's again a mafia type of model. In either of these cases, the halacha is lo yatsa l'cherus. See, normally we have a rabbinic injunction that if you if you do something wrong in regards to your slave, that you need to free them. If you sell them to a goy, for example, you need to free them. Here you didn't sell it to a goy; it was taken by a goy, and it's a little bit different. Says the Gemara, is that true? Uvechovo lo. Is that true that when it comes to chov that you are not yatsa l'cherus? I'll show you a case where there was chov was collected with an eved, and in fact the transaction really did take place. Uvechovolo, 3 lines down, Ramini, we have a brisa that disagrees with this. The brisa from Chulin says, Haresha ansu beis hamelech gorano. If a government official forcibly takes your grain, im bechovo. If it's like the IRS, it's like taking a piece of your property. Im bechovo, if it's to balance out something that you owe, so you owe the government back taxes of $10,000. So they take your car, which is worth $10,000. So then the halacha is chayav le'aser. You're effectively like a mocher, and we say that you need to give meiser on that product, on whatever they're taking from the goren. So that shows us that really chovo that is a real thing. Even though in the previous case it was forced, we said lo yatsa l'cherus. Here in the case of the goren, if it's bechovo, chayav la'aser, and that's a stira. Ve'im ve'an piros, if they're just taking it by force for no good reason, Rashi says hefsed, they're just taking it to create a loss for you. So then pater mila'aser. So how do we answer this question between the two brisas? The Gemara says shiny hasam the kamishtar shile. There, in regards to the case of the goren, where the government comes in and takes whatever your grains that you have that you owe, in that case, you actually are evening out a chov. There's actually somewhat of a benefit for you. But in our case, you didn't want the whole scenario to happen, and you didn't owe them anything. So there, the Gemara says that the cases are not the same. And therefore, in the first case of giva'o bechovo or lakhu sikrikon, in those cases, if the evid is taken away, we don't have the rabbinic injunction of the Baal needing to free that eved. Says the Gemara 7 lines down, Tashma, de Amarav, Rav says, Hamocher avdo lefarhang, ove kochavim. If you sell your eved to a farhang who's like an executioner kind of a guy, it's not a good guy, who's an ove kochavim, so then the Gemara says, Yatsa l'cherus. So there you're yatsa l'cherus. And hasam, why is it that you're yatsa l'cherus? Because havale lefais velo pies. He's yatsa l'cherus, meaning we hold you accountable. And the reason we hold you accountable is because you should have pushed harder. You should have tried to convince this person, and you didn't. And let's analyze this line a little more, though this does seem like a very, very similar repeat. Gufa. The Gemara says, Amar Rab hamocher avdo lefar hangovid kochavim yatsa l'cherus, the same exact line. The Gemara says, my havale lemevad. What was he supposed to do? Why are you saying it's yatsa l'cherus? Why are you saying that the Eved who was taken, he was taken by this executioner? Why in that case do we say that he's Yatsa l'cherus? Why do we force the Baal to free him? After all, the Baal didn't choose this scenario. And the Gemara says, because Mahavale lefayis velo pies, he didn't try hard enough, and he should have tried harder to free him. Okay. What if, let's just repeat our sugya again. We're trying to figure out the scope of when a Baal has to free his eved by force, by halachic force. He has to free his eved in the scenario that he gives away or sells his eved to a goy. What if it's only for short term? Says the Gemara 12 lines down. Boy Reb Yirmiyah machru l'shloshim yom mahu. If a person only sold his eved for 30 days, he sold him for a month, and in a month he anticipates getting him back. So then the Gemara says, Machru l'shloshim yom mahu. So then Tashma, let's see if we can bring a raya from our case to Amar Rav HaMocher Avdo lefarhang ove kochavim yatsa l'cherus. We see over there that in a case where he gives the eved to a farhang, to this executioner who's a non-Jew, and the Rishonim here point out that we're talking about only for a short period of time, yatsa l'cherus. So there we see that in both cases it's yatsa l'cherus, said that even if you sell for a short amount of time, it seems to be that the din is that you're still yatsa l'cherus, meaning the Baal is forced by halacha to free him because you should have done more work to try and save that person. So says the Gemara, that's not a good raya because Hasan befarang ovi kochavim she'ein chozeres. The case in that brisa was not a short-term sale to the executioner who's a goy, but rather it was a long-term sale, so no raya. Then the Gemara asks a litany of questions. Again, all trying to figure out the scope and parameters of when we say that the Baal is forced by halacha to free his eved. And the Gemara says a quarter of the way down, Machru chutz mimalachto mahu. What if he was sold not for his actual avdas? And the Rishonim here point out, let's say that he was sold in order to have babies with someone else's shivcha, but his actual slave status remains with the initial person. So that was with a goy. So what do you do there? What if it's chutz min hamitzvos mahu? What if he is sold to a goy, but part of the deal is that he still gets to keep mitzvos? Or chutz mi shabbosas v'yamim tovim mahu? Or if I sell him to a goy, but I make a condition that he has vacation days on Shabbos v'yom tov. That was what just happened in Supreme Court this week. There's a big deal that by the non-Jews that this mailman had a whole lawsuit. It ended up in Supreme Court that he wanted to have a day off on Sunday and they penalized him. He ended up leaving his job, but that was his holy day. So Supreme Court sided with him, which is great for religious rights in general. It's very good for us to have these kinds of precedent. So the Aguda just sent out an email explaining all of it, which is the only reason I knew what was going on because I'm not holding cup, but it was a good thing. So here, let's say they had this idea in the Gemara already, a third of the way down. Let's say that I sell my eved to a goy, but it's bitnai that he's allowed to keep Shabbos and Yom Tov, or leger toshav liYisrael mumar mahu, or if you sell it not to a regular goy, but to a ger toshav, and typically we assume that a ger toshav is someone, as Rashi points out, two-thirds of the way down, a little bit more than halfway down, is leger toshav shekibel alav shelo lavod avodas kochavim ve'ochel nevelos. What an odd Rashi. What's ochel nevelos?
He's permitted to eat nevelos.
Shekibel alav shelo la'avod.
Because he's living among us in Eretz Yisrael, we give him permission to stay, but he has to play by our rules. No avodas are permitted. But he's a goy, so go ahead and eat what you like.
Ve'ochel nevelos is not part of the shelo category.
I believe it means and he can. Otherwise, like you said, why don't of all things, why that? I believe it's that he's permitted to, but avodas zarah we don't want him doing among us. And goy can't do avodas zarah anyway.
So this ger toshav is a goy.
Mm-hmm.
When in the shiur that I listened to in preparing it said that they keep the sheva mitzvos b'nei Noach. That's not this Rashi.
As such,
What's ochel? I know, but I'm just saying it's not Rashi.
Why? I mean, I believe Rashi's just going from somewhere, but that's how the ger toshav is always described, and I don't know why it's not. They agree.
Why does Rashi say the ochel nevelos?
No problem. He's not Jewish.
Who cares? Well, it was not to do with anything.
Yeah.
Just just say he's a ben Noach. Just say he's keeping the Noahide laws.
A ger toshav agrees to live in Eretz Yisrael. Remember, there's a mitzvah to expel everybody.
Right.
They are permitted to stay ger toshav. He's a stranger,
but he's a settler. Yeah.
And but he agrees to abide by our rules. What are our rules?
Okay.
Well, you're a goy. You don't have to eat kosher.
No, I understand. Just a quick. This Rashi.
Shavim is a better description.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't understand. I hear what you're saying, and these facts in Rashi may well be true, but it's not broad enough. Like it should have been. And when I say it's not broad enough, I'm sure I'm wrong.
one of the.
Yeah. It's odd.
And one of the things he's permitted.
So
to do.
Rabbi Resnick said that this was talking about the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Okay,
I think
requires more research. Requires more
That
research.
that description.
Yeah.
I think is a Chazal.
Just to understand Rashi's intent, but
I think it's a quote of a Chazal.
it is.
But
It says on the side here that it's from Ayin Lekaman Memhei Amud Aleph. We'll talk tomorrow. Tomorrow morning, bright and early. Okay, where are we? Okay, so the Gemara says that what about all of these cases? Toshav Yisrael Mumar. What if you give it over to a Yisrael Mumar? This just came up in a conversation today. A conservative woman said, well, somebody told me I needed to use you because you're Orthodox. Well, I mean, according to me, I would even use a conservative model. So I have become a kanoi in my relatively older age, and I explained to her why that doesn't work. And I said, if someone is not keeping the covenant of Sabbath, of keeping the covenant of the Torah, they can't be a practitioner of circumcision. It's a contradiction in terms. You can't have it both ways. It's not about Orthodox and conservative. It's about observance. And I hope that I'll still get the bris, but that's what, that was the conversation. Lakusi Mahu, what about someone who's a kusi? We know that this was where they gere arios, where they go because of lions, did they convert for wrong reasons, they convert for right reasons. And then says the Gemara, all of these are great questions, fine questions. And Pashit Mihachada, here's at least one answer. Ger Toshav Harehu Ka'oved Kochav. We're not messing around. You can't sell an Eved to a Ger Toshav, whatever he is. Let's assume he's keeping the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach. I told you this story already, no? One of the Chabad rabbis here has a chavrusa with a guy to teach them the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, because the Lubavitcher Rebbe held that there was a mitzvah of kiruv by anyone who has a chiyuv mitzvos, which is everybody. We have 613, they have 7. So he's their rabbi. And he was at the circumcision that I did, where I made 0 brachos, no talis, no cup, and I didn't give any credence whatsoever. They're mamish goyim. But they have a rabbi, they have a chavrusa every Thursday night. I've never heard of such a thing, and it's a crazy message. Kusi v'Yisrael Mumar. What about those two? If you have a Kusi, again, we're not sure about their status. And Yisrael Mumar, someone who's not so from. So Amri Lakel Avod Kochavim. Some say that they're treated like a goy, and we sometimes have this, Mumar Mumar Dino Ke'oved Kochavim. We have this in Halacha. The Amri Laki Yisrael. Some say that this would be counted as a Yisrael. The Mainaf Kamina in this case that's our whole case. Can you give over an Eved? Can you sell an Eved to one of these people? If you hold that they're an Oved Kochavim, you cannot. And if you hold that a Kusi and Yisrael Mumar are a Jew, then you're allowed to sell an Eved.
So Mumar in general is someone who doesn't observe Hashem Shabbos Kashrus.
Broader, someone who's a Mumar, Mumar l'davar echad. Mumar l'davar echad is someone who says, I'm from, but I wear shatnas. I'm from, but I eat treif. I'm from, but.
But that's not.
That's why they're a Mumar. They're Mumar l'davar echad. So there's multiple categories of Mumar. The lowest level is a Mumar l'davar echad. I'm Orthodox, but I don't believe in this law. No, you're a Mumar. You're not Orthodox. Right? You don't get to cut a pasuk out of Chumash. That's not how things work. So that's a Mumar l'davar echad. And there's a broader area, which is Mumar l'chol Torah kula. But we're pretty makbid on these things. I think by bris milah, if you're a Mumar for anything, you're done. You can't be a Mumar. All right, 2 dots. 2 dots? Yeah, 2 dots. Bo minei Rav Ami. Eved shehipil atzmo legaisos. If an Eved fell into the hands of a marauding army, ve'ein rabbo yachol lehotzio, and there's no way for the master to get the Eved out. Lo b'dinei Yisrael, not in a Jewish court, but lo b'dinei ovdei kochavim, and not in a secular court. Mao sheyitol es dama. Is he allowed to collect funds if these are nice marauding soldiers? They're like, we stole your guy. By the way, here's a check. So the Gemara wants to know, are you allowed to accept that check? Are you allowed to accept the money? Please go look into your Svarim, go look into your books, go look into the Mishnayos. Now remember what we're talking about. These are Amoraim. The only literature that they had was what Rebbe had just put together, which is the Mishnayos. So Nafaki went out, Duk ve'ashkach, he searched and he found the Tanya, there's a Brisa. If I sell my house to an Oved Kochavim, Dama Vasurim, I'm not allowed to benefit from the funds. And if there's an Eved who takes my house without permission, and I'm not able to get the house back in any legal way, not from a Yiddish court and not from a court of Ovdei Kochavim, so motor litol as damav. So in those cases you are allowed to. So when you do it on your own, okay, you're not allowed to benefit. But when your hand is forced, so then you are allowed to benefit. Because you can even bring this up in a secular court, because you're saving your own money from the hands of a guy, no problem at all. So therefore, the Gemara thinks that it has an answer. Our case was the case of an Eved who fell into the marauding army, and there they offered to pay. Am I allowed to say yes or no? Well, we can see from this case that you're allowed to say yes, because in the case of in this brisa where it says Oved Kochavim Sha'anas Beso Shal Yisrael, the din is that he's allowed to mutar litolas damav. Says the Gemara, not necessarily, 2/3 of the way down, almost at least. The dil mahani mili bias. Maybe the halachos are different by a house. The kevan delo sagi lebelo bias, because it's not, nobody would live without a house. You need somewhere to live. People don't live on the streets unless they don't have a choice. But if you're not going to get rid of your house for no good reason. So then lo asi lizvuni, you're not going to come to sell it. Aval avda, but a slave is not a staple of life. The sagi lebelo abda. People can live without that. So asi lizvuni, they were more concerned about selling it. Olo. So which one is it? How do we view this din? Do we say that you are yitol estam, you're allowed to take money when your eved gets stolen from you, and then they offered to pay, yes or no? So shalach lahu Rabbi Ami, the following strong line of conviction in psak halacha. Mini, from me, Ami bar Nasan, Torah, I'm teaching you a din, yotza l'chol Yisrael, this is fitting to be told to all Jews. If you have a case where an Eved gets captured by marauding soldiers, the halacha is mutar lital as damav. You are absolutely allowed to take funds, no problem at all. And you can have it all well documented in the courts of non-Jews. Period. Gavel drop. No questions asked. This is very simple. If your Eved is taken from you, then they say, listen, yeah, we're mafia, we stole your Eved, but we're not jerks about it, we're going to write you a check. So the halacha is that you're allowed to accept the money, no problem. We are now 2/3, 3/4 of the way down. Amar of Yeshua ben Levi. If a man sells his Eved to a non-Jew, kon senoso ad mea bedamav. Wow. The knas is 100-fold. So if your Eved is $100, so what's that? That's $10,000, right? Is that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the Gemara says, dafka o lav dafka. Like, is this a number specific? Is this really a ratio of 100? So Tashma, let's see. And the Gemara is going to show that there's an example of another. Throw out their, exaggerative numbers. Says the Gemara, Tashma, Damaresh Lakish, Hamocher Behema Gasalo, Oved Kochavim, unrelated to this sugya at all, but Rashi highlights a Gemara from Avodah Zarah. They were not allowed to sell Behema Gas to Avodah Kochavim because of how they may use it. So the din is kontzino so'ada sara b'dameh. It's 10 times. So the Gemara seems to imply that maybe the numbers are random. Says no, maybe there really is a difference between them. The dilma shiny Eved, maybe by Eved there really is a difference, and there really is a 10-fold difference between that and the behema, because the kol yoma v'yoma mifkalemi mitzvos. We don't mess around when it comes to mitzvos. You gotta perform, and in fact we have dinim. The din is that you're kol hon besa. You have to give up everything to avoid an isur doraisa. And by mitzvos aseh, kol mavaz beis alivaz v'yosem richomesh. So some of the Rishonim point out that it applies over there in that case of hamavaz beis alivaz beis yosem richomesh. We have to give a lot. Either way, perhaps we should say that he should spend the $10,000 on the $100 Eved, because he's got that guy. He needs to be keeping halacha. You just sold him to a guy. It's completely inappropriate. You're not allowed to do that. Gets into the intersecting halachos of when you cause other people to do averos because of a scenario in which you put them. So what if you give someone a job and the environment is an environment that is nearly impossible to be matzliach? So then isn't it this case? You should be matzah. You should save the guy. Okay. So the Gemara says as follows. Some say that this sugya was learned a little differently. Amar of Yeshua ben Levi. A little bit different. In the first version of this, we saw that it was 100-fold. Here, what do we see in the second version of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi? It's also a different name. Before it was Rish Lakish. And maybe it's only 10-fold. Is that dafka or lav dafka? Which one is it? So it says the Gemara, Tashma, let's see. Here we see the reverse in numbers, 10 by the Eved and 100 by the Behema, completely reversed from Ravashi. So there the Gemara says 6 lines from the bottom, shiny Eved to lo hadalei. It's different with an Eved because the Eved is, you should pay for him to be free, but he's never going to become your Eved again, right? Because he's freed already. That's the din that happened. When you sell him to a guy, you have to free him. So you have to free him, but you have to pay to free him, and you have to pay only 10-fold. Why not 100-fold? Because he's never going to work for you again. So you're invested in his freedom, and you only have to pay up to 10. El behema my time of my. Why is it that by a behema that you're going to pay much more? Because when you get that Eved, when you get that behema back from the guy, you're going to keep it. Mishum dehadralei. So says the Gemara, why don't we just make a distinction between an Eved and a behema that's much smaller? Liknset feichad. Maybe we should say by the behema that it's 11-fold, and by the Eved it's only 10-fold. Says the Gemara, I should say a little sharper. The Gemara is bothered by the fact that it's a 10-to-1 ratio, that it's 100 to 10. What are with the numbers? If you want to show that there's something more unique about a behemoth and that you're getting the behemoth back and you're not getting the evet back, make the distinction smaller. What's with the 100 to 10? The Gemara agrees with this, and 4 lines from the bottom on the first of the long lines, Mem Daled Mem Aleph, the Gemara says, Eved milsa de lo shchicha. The case of an Eved being captured is very uncommon. Milsa de lo shchicha lo gazru be rabbanon. There really is no gzera de rabbanon in such a case for the finances. So the numbers are as they are. Let's say that I don't want to use myself because the person will pass away in about 4 seconds. But let's say that Ruvain sold an Eved to a guy, which he should not have done, umes, and then he died. So what's the din? Had he not died, he would have been obligated to spend money to free the Eved. That's his obligation. Does that obligation pass on to his Yorshim? Let's say, Ruvain's child is Shimon. So the Shimon have to pay for Ruvain's mistake. The Gemara says, Maushi yiknesu es beno acharab. Im tim tzalomar, in regards to the sugya of Bechor, of an animal that is a firstborn, that serem, ozen, Bechor, b'meis, that if I injured or damaged the ear of a Bechor and then died, kansu beno acharab, there the child of that person has a knas, and he has to take care of the Bechor issues, whatever that may be. But there, that may be different because mishum de isura de oraisahi. There, by the case of the Bechor, for you to cause damage, for you to create a movement that animals in isura de oraisa. So perhaps over there, when we say that the burden does travel from Ruvain, the father, to Shimon, his son, that's because it's a din de oraisa. Aval hacha, perhaps in our case, it's only isura de rabbanon, and therefore we don't have anything to be worried about. And if the father were to have sold the Evet to a guy, there's no burden of responsibility on him. And on the top of Mem Daled Amud Beis, we'll be going to the very top, about 5 lines into Mem Hey Amud Aleph, and then we'll pause right before the wide lines. Let's give another case scenario. Let's say we know that there is malacha during Chol HaMoed. We don't behave that way, but there really is malacha during Chol HaMoed, and according to some Rishonim, that's a din d'oraisa. I think it's in the Gemara, actually. I think it's a machlokas in the Gemara. Can't remember which one right now. Sorry. It's in Moed Katan. I know which Gemara it's in. I just don't know what level of the machlokas is. But anyways, according to many, there is a status of an Isser Deraisa Malacha during Chol HaMoed is still Moed status. So let's say that this guy was Kivein Malachto b'Moed. I set up a scenario where I could have done better preparing, but I didn't. I said, I'm going to start the cooking process right before Yontif starts on a Tuesday, and I'm going to finish the cooking on Chol HaMoed. So that's Kivein Malachto b'Moed. Now his intent was to do something wrong, but then umes, before he could do something wrong and violate the halachos of Chol HaMoed, he died. So there we have a din of lo kansu b'no achara, but there that case is also not a raya. Why is that case not a proof for us at all? Because mishum delo avad isura. At the end, yes, you plan to do something wrong. It's poorly intended. And poorly executed because you died, so then it didn't work out. So there, mishum delo avad isura. But hacha over here, perhaps within the camp of kivein malachto b'moed meis, maybe this approach would say that here, because you actually did something wrong, which is Ruvain sold the Evet to a guy, perhaps we should say that it goes to the Yorshim. And then the Gemara, I love this distinction. The Gemara says, L'didei kansu rabbanon, is the knas on the person who did the sale, and v'halese, he's now 6 feet under. Odilma, the knas is not on the person, but it's rather limamone kansu rabbanon v'ha'ise. Okay, so let's say that Ruvain sells an Evet to a goy and dies, and the Chachamim say knas, we're slapping you on the wrist, and you have to free him. Is the knas on the person, and now the person died, so now we don't have to worry about the children, or is the knas on the mamonis aspects of Ruvain? And because Ruvain's Yerusha went to Shimon, so therefore we should be concerned. That's how the Gemara frames this out. And the Gemara responds on Mem Daled Amud Beis 5 lines down by quoting a brisa from Maseches Shvis. The Gemara says, Amar le Tanituha, we already have an answer for this. Netaiva onadaira, these are 2 different languages of fertilizing the ground. If a person did that during the Shemitah year, lo tizra lemote Shvis, then you're not, I skipped a line, excuse me, Tanituha. Sada shenis kavtza b'shvis, if there's a field and you dethorned the field, I don't know if that's a word, but today it is. You remove all the thorns from the field and you do it during shvis, during the 7th year, not during the beginning of, not during that. You do it at a time before you prepare the field. So says the Gemara, if you do that, tizra l'motzei shvius, then you're allowed to be like that. You didn't do anything wrong. All you did was remove weeds. Removing weeds is not actually even touching the ground. You're just getting the weeds out. But netaiva nadaira, if you did fertilize the ground, that's really preparing the ground, and therefore lo tizra l'motzei shvius. And says the Gemara on this brisa, Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina naktin, and we have a tradition. Hetiva v'meis. If Ruvain was to fertilize the ground and then he died, bino zora, his son is allowed to plant. What is the inference we see from this Mishnah in Maseches Shvius? Alma lididei kansu rabbanon, libre lo kansu rabbanon. And then therefore we carry that answer back over to our sugya, and the knas of the Chachamim, when a man sells his eved to a non-Jew, is didei. It is on Ruvain. It's not on his finances. Where do we attach the knas to? Is it to the person? And if he goes to the grave, then these issues die with him, yes or no? The Gemara says the knas is only on him, and therefore it doesn't transfer over to his kids. About 12 lines down on Mem Daled Amud Beis, the Gemara says, Amar Abai, Naktinan, we have a tradition. Time taharos shel chavero. Let's say that I'm tamei and I walk over to your chalas that are all tahor, and I make them all tamei, and then Ruvain dies, the guy who makes it tamei dies. Lo kansu rabbanan v'no acharab. Very similar line of reasoning. Why? Because it's about you who did something wrong, not about the mammonis components, and therefore it doesn't transfer down to the next generation. My Taima asks the Gemara, when it comes to the case of Timei Taros, why is it that we have this case that it doesn't pass down to the kids? The Gemara says, Hezek she'eno nikar, lo shmei hezek. This is a very fascinating idea. We're talking about Tuma. You just ruined $100 of my bread, and I spent 30 hours making these challahs. But it's hezek she'eno nikar. The challahs look the same, they smell the same. It's just that they're tamei now. So says the Gemara that when it comes to tuma, hezek she'eno nikar lo shmei hezek. That is not called hezek. And the Gemara says, therefore, that if Ruvain were to be metame them and then Ruvain dies, his son Shimon is not obligated to pay back for the taros that he ruined. V'knasa de rabbanan. Anyways, we're only dealing with a knas de rabbanan, and therefore lididei kansuhu rabbanan libre lo kakansu rabbanan.
What isn't nikar? Because you know
it's not nikar. It's not nikar. Nikar is 5 senses. What we're supposed to do? You walk in the room, you can't tell if it's tamei. Chaim Kanievsky can tell if it's tamei. We can't.
Right.
So that's not called hezek. Hezek is when the shopping cart goes into the car and you see the grill from the shopping cart in your door. That's shmei hezek, because it's nikar, which happened to me, which is what I'm talking about.
We're your therapists.
I'm venting. I'm done now. But it was still a good example to the question.
No.
It's just not considered. It's its own sugya. It really is, because we have a din d'Rabbanan that he has to pay back still because it's not fair.
Right.
But midina, as it relates to the world of Nezikin, it's lo shmei hezek. Fascinating. At the 2 dots, a third of the way down, as you can see, this Gemara is more technical and taking a little longer. And that's why we broke up the learning the way we're doing it tonight. So Tana Rabbanan, the Gemara says, Hamocher avdo lechutz la'aretz. If I sell my eved to a person, even to a Jew who lives in chutz la'aretz, yotza lecherus v'tzarich get shichur me'rabo sheni. Very interesting. If I sell my eved to you and you move to chutz la'aretz, so then the eved gets to go free and he gets to get shichur from the second person. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Pa'amim yatsa upa'amim lo yatsa. It depends. Sometimes the eved goes free, and sometimes the eved doesn't go free when he gets sold to chutz la'aretz. And then the Gemara says, Ketzad. What is an example? So Omar, if the transaction that took place, at least in speech, was like this: Ploni avdi mechartihu leploni antuchi. I am selling my eved to you from the city of Antuch, which was in chutz la'aretz. So if you're from the city of Antuch, does that mean you're going to chutz la'aretz? Says the Gemara lo yatsa. That's not enough, because you may still live in Eretz Yisrael. My father is from Charleston. If I say my father's from Charleston, he doesn't live in Charleston anymore. I mean, he does in a way, but he's still here, the Maisa. So the Gemara says that if he says that this person's from Antuchi, we don't assume that he's from there. Doesn't mean he's moving there. That's just where he was born. So the Gemara therefore says lo yotza. That's not a grounds for if I were to sell an eved to my father, and I would say to my father from Charleston, that doesn't work. That doesn't mean he's going to leave Eretz Yisrael. However, le'antuchi, to this guy from Antuchi, shebe Antuchia, who actually lives in Antuchia. Oh, it's a whole new ballgame. There, the Gemara says yatza. There, the Eved does get freed because now we know he's going back to his hometown. My father from Charleston, who lives in Charleston, 100%, he's going to leave Eretz Yisrael and go to Charleston. Then it's yatza l'cherus.
But what it's saying with father already make it a more precise thing so that there wouldn't be any confusion?
Well, I mean, the case over here is where I said I'm selling it mechartihu leploni antuchi. I'm selling it to you from Charleston.
Right, and since
We're
there's
talking to the best example in the world.
Well,
His name is Tex. How long since you last lived in Texas?
it's 30 some odd years.
Best example in the world.
that's not bad. I didn't put it together. I'm very tired. What's your question?
No, but I think the whole point of this is that it's so that you can identify who that person is.
The first phrase,
Right.
correct, but it doesn't tell you where he lives.
No, but what I'm saying is if you're saying, you know what, there's Steve Karesh from Charleston who lives in Charleston, or if you specifically say my father, then they know, like everybody knows, you don't necessarily have to say the one who's from Charleston who now lives in Chicago.
You're adding another layer of what if people know where he lives. I mean, it's a what if question. You may well be right. You may well be right. But here, and I don't know, like, is this going to be in a star? I don't know. I'm not sure. I hear your question, and it may well be that you're right. I didn't look into that at all, but I hear you. So the distinction is that if you only say that the guy is from place X in Chutz La'aretz, that's not sufficient to require the Rabbo to free up the Eved. But if we say that he's from city X and he lives in city X in Chutz La'aretz, then for sure he's Yotze. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second, halfway down, Mem Daled Amud Beis. V'atanya mechartiu le'antuchi yotza. Look at that. It's exactly not what we learned. I sold it to someone in Antuchi, someone from Antuchi, he's freed, and the Brisa continues. Le'antuchi hashiri belud lo yatza. But there's also a community that was in Lud called Antuchi. There, you're not Yotze. So there, what do we see? That in the first part of the second Brisa, it says that mechartil la'antuchi, that is yatza. So that implies that saying where you're from, just from Charleston, that's sufficient to create a need to free the Eved. So what's the answer? Lo kashya, says the Gemara. Hadisle beisa be'eretz Yisrael. It depends. If the guy has a house in Eretz Yisrael, so then we don't assume he's leaving. But if he's only renting, hadisle ushpiza be'eretz Yisrael, or he's staying in a hostel, or whatever the parameters are of this non-ownership. I don't know, the bank's holding my money. Do I own my house? To a degree I do, but I haven't really paid for the whole thing yet. It's kind of on loan. Whatever the case may be, then we would say that that's the distinction. If you have a house in Eretz Yisrael, we'll assume you'll stay. And if you're only renting, we'll assume you'll go back to your hometown. Ba Reb Yirmiyah. Ben Bavel shenosa isha be'eretz Yisrael. A man from Bavel who marries a woman from Eretz Yisrael. V'hichnisa lo, and she brings into the marriage avodim ushvachos. V'daito lachzor, he wants to move back to Bavel. Mahu. What a beautiful application of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah was talking about a case where I sell my Eved to you who is now moving from Yerushalayim to France. So this guy is from Bavel. So he gets married. His wife brings shvachim and avodos shvachos and avodim into the marriage, and then daito lachzor, that he's going to go back and live in Bavel. So what happens to the shvachos and the avodim? Mahu. So says the Gemara, we have to get into the case of nichse tzon barzel. The case of nichse tzon barzel is when a woman brings something into the marriage. Let's say they get married on Aleph Adar. So the din is by nichse tzon barzel, that whatever she brings into the marriage is assessed on that day, market value. Let's say she brings in gold bars, and she brings in gold bars that are evaluated on that day to be $10,000. So the din is that whenever there's a divorce, he's obligated to pay her $10,000, the market value of those gold bars, even if 10 years later it's only worth $3 in the market. We locked in the prices on Aleph Adar the year they got married. That's nichse tzon barzel. Now, well, let's say she says, I'd rather have the bars and not the money. Can she do that? Because in a case where the market was the other way, the husband might want the bars. right? Let's say that the bars were evaluated at $10,000 on Aleph Adar. 2 years later, they get divorced, and the market value of the bars is $40,000, huge jump in the market. He says, here's $10,000, sweetheart. I am the winner here because I have the gold bars. I'm going to go cash them out, and I'll make 40 minus your 10. I've netted 30. This is fantastic. So what does she have a right to say? The bars, or does she have to only accept the money? This is a machlokas. And the Gemara says that the question that we just asked about this man from Bavel who married a woman who brought shvachos and avadim in, this question applies to Boilaman Damar Hadinima. There are those within the sugya of Nichsetzon Barzel that the halacha is like her, that she can get whatever she wants. And the question also applies to Boilaman Damar Hadinimo. There are those that say that whatever is beneficial for the husband is what he'll do for its own Barzel. So whichever one is less expensive is what he'll give her. So says the Gemara, let's analyze 2/3 of the way down. Tiboy leman da'amar hadinima. This is still a very good question, even according to the one who says hadinima, and because I might have thought that kevan de hadinima kidi damo. Perhaps we'd say that because when it comes to nichsetzon barzel, we side with her. So perhaps even when they live in Bavel, really the avadim belong to her. Oh, Dilma, Kaven de Mishab de Le Lepira, because the payros, the produce that's generated by the avadim goes to the husband, therefore kidi de dami. So we therefore don't know. Is it going to be that the payros are enough to say that it's like him, in which case it's as if I sold to someone in Chutz La'aretz and I'm obligated to free them, or no? Is it like her? And as well, v'tiboy lemanda amar hadinimo, the Gemara says that perhaps that our question applies even according to the side of the machlokes of Nichsetzon Barzel, who holds that the husband gets to choose what happens. And says the Gemara, perhaps we should say that they're like him, and because he's a ben Bavel, then they need to be free. Because really he doesn't own the bodies themselves. They're nichsetzon barzel. They actually belong to the wife. He's just allowed to benefit from them. Kididadamo. And after this very sophisticated layered question, the Gemara gives a very simple answer of teku. We just don't know. 3/4 of the way down to the 2 dots. We're getting there. Amar Rabbi Abo, Shanali Rabbi Yochanan. He says, Rabbi Yochanan taught me. These are the moments when you can see generations. Rabbi Abo was right after Rabbi Yochanan. Good to remember for the future. The Gemara says, Eved sheyatza achar Rabbo l'Surya. If an Eved follows his Rav into Surya, and we have a machlokas even in regards to Gittin about Surya, but here we're treating Surya like Chutz La'aretz. Umachro sham Rabbo, and his Rebbe sells him once he's there. Yatza l'cheirus. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to sell him to anybody who's living in Chutz La'aretz. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. You're saying Yatza l'cheirus v'hatani, that if we have a brisa that says in the name of Reb Chia, Ibed esechu, so that if he follows his boss, he loses his rights to go free. He chose to go with him. That's his problem. If he was forced and he wouldn't have had a choice, in Yatza l'cheirus, but he chose to follow. Says the Gemara, lo kasha, kansha das rabo lachsor, kansha ein das rabo lachsor. The difference between these two approaches, these two brisas, they're not brisas, they're memras. That would be just the difference of what the intention of the Rab is. If the intention of the Rab is to be choser back to Eretz Yisrael, so then he's not free. But if it's to stay out, then he is free. Says the Gemara of Tanya, we have this idea. This is Rashi says, Benichusa, Yotze ha'eved achar Rabo l'Surya. What do you mean, Yotze? That he's forced to go? Lo sagi de lo nafik. Doesn't he have control of himself to not go v'atznan? Ve'ein hakol motziin. So that's why the Gemara says it wasn't, the language is not Yotze elo yotza. It's not that he will be taken, it's that he chose to go. And that's the distinction to be made. Yotze v'nachar Rabo b'Surya machar Rabo sham. That's a machlokas. It's not a machlokas, but there's a bifurcation. Im das Rabo lachsor kofen oso. Ve'im ein das Rabo lachsor in kofen oso. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Anan shamis minei demar Shmuel tarte. He says, I learned 2 things from Shmuel. The Gemara says, one is this din that we were just discussing about the Eved being brought into Chutz La'aretz. The Idach, and the second din that I learned is the Itmar. We have a statement in the Amoraim that speaks about Yovel. We don't usually talk about the year of Yovel itself. Says the Gemara as follows. Says the Gemara de Itmar, Hamocher Sadeu Bishnas Hayovel Atzma. Normally, we know that in a Yovel year, all farms, all lands go back to stay. They all go back to their original owners. So the Gemara says, what if I make a sale during the 50th year? Is that even mechanically possible in halachic terms? So the Gemara says that this is subject to a discussion. The Gemara says, Rav Amar Mechura v'yotza. There is a sale, but then the sale immediately reverses. And then Shmuel says, Shmuel Amar, Eina Mechura Kol Iker. There's a zero, non-starter. We were discussing this yesterday. We had some cases where the Kiddushin was Chal, and some cases where the Kiddushin was not Chal. So Bechada says the Gemara that Rav Anan is continuing his comment. Bechada, in one case, says the Gemara, Hadre Zvini, the money returns. Ubechada lo Hadre Zvini, and in another case, the money doesn't go back to its original owner. Velo Yadana Haimina. Rav Anan says, I don't know which one's which. And Amar Rav Yosef, Nechse Anan, I can answer your question. Says the Gemara, Midatani bebraisa. We have a brisa. What does the brisa say? 2 lines from the bottom on Mem Daled Amud Beis. Amocher avdo l'chutz la'aretz yotza l'cheirus. If I sell my eved to someone who lives in chutz la'aretz, my eved goes free. V'tzarech get shichrur me'rabo sheni. And who does the shichrur? The second owner, shmamina kanye rabo sheni v'lo hadre zvine. It seems to be that the transaction was valid. Because if the transaction wasn't valid, then why is Rabo Sheni writing the get shichrur? It should have been me, Rabo Rishon. So therefore, it must be that the transaction was real. And V'chi Amar Shmuel Hasam Eina Mechura, when Shmuel said in regards to the case of Yovel, that a transaction that's made during the year of Yovel is a non-starter, so that's U'ma'os Chosron. In that case, the money returns. And says the Gemara Rav Anan, turning to the top of Mem Hamid Beis, why is it that Rav Anan, Rashi says, Rav Anan, de lo yada b'haimi nahu, amar bebraisa de le'el, lo hava shmiele, de liv shot mini. He never heard of the brisa. Says the Gemara top line, Rav Anan, braisa lo shmiele. It's amazing to think that we know more brisas than some of the Amoraim, because it was chaos. I mean, there was barely Mishnayos at that time. It must have been extremely difficult to learn a sugya properly, because it was all reliant on what you knew by heart. And if you didn't know, there were no svarim. And if you couldn't go knock on the Rav's door you're done. You're done. You're stuck. It was a very hard time to learn for many people. And again, they knew a lot of stuff by heart, which we don't. But okay, so Rav Anan didn't know the answer. So says the Gemara, what about learning from Shmuel? Why didn't Rav Anan learn from Shmuel? V'imi de Shmuel mimai de'ein mechuro mos chosren. How do we know that when Shmuel said in the case of Yovel that the transaction of selling the field during the Yovel year just doesn't work? How do we know U'ma'os Chosren? There's no reason that Rav Anan should have thought that. Dilma, perhaps we should have thought that Eina Mechura, that you're right, that the sale doesn't work, but U'ma'os Matana Ninhu. But the money remains a Matana, because you should have known better. Midi dehavi amakadesh esachoso. Just like when a guy goes over to his sister and proposes. What does he say? If a guy goes over to his full sister, even his half sister, and says, that's not a chuppah. That's not kiddushin. That's a zero. That's like trying to propose to an inanimate object halachically. It does not work. It's a zero non-starter. So what happens over there with the money? So there, Rav Amar Ma'os Chosren. What does Shmuel say? Shmuel Amar, no, Ma'os Matana. There's no way he intended to ever get that money back. So if a guy walks over to his sister and gives her $100 and says, "Harem mikudeshesli b'mea dollars zuka das Moshe b'Yisrael," the halacha is that she keeps the money, because he should have known better. That's why Rav Anan couldn't infer anything from Shmuel. We'll stop right here. We'll pick up with Amar Le'abaye tomorrow at 7:10. Wishing you all a beautiful night.
Did we talk about